Welcome to the Under the Hat podcast,
the show where we talk about everything and anything that is top of mind in education.
The goal is to provide meaningful conversations to what is currently happening in our classrooms.
Stories, pains,
moments of success.
We want to hear it all.
Hey friends, welcome back to another episode of Under the Hat. I'm your co-host, Steve Martinez. You'll notice that we're one co-host short. Sophie is out traveling, doing some Cami traveling. But I'm super excited today because we get to chat with Katie Novak. I'm a big fan of not just Katie, but also UDL. And spoiler alert, we probably will be talking about UDL over the course of this episode. But Katie, thanks for coming on. How are you?
I am doing so well. I was loving watching like that highlight reel to kick off the show. And I was like wishing that I had like a chef's hat. Like that one, it spoke to me. I feel like I could have rocked a chef hat today. And like, how do we cook up really great learning experiences? I could have slayed that metaphor, but it was fun to like watch that. I'm like, woo, we're on.
So I'll be honest, I take no credit for that. So my co-host, Sophie Young, she's the one that does all the graphics. Anything that looks cute was not me. So big shout out to Sophie for contributing to the show in that way. So Katie, I'm super, excited to have this chat. And for those that, maybe don't know you or know your work, maybe just give us a little bit of context, like your educational journey.
Yeah, I'd love to. So hello, everyone. Hi, I'm Katie Novak, and I have been a lifetime educator. So right after I went to college, I got my master's degree in education, and then I taught high school and middle school English for over a decade before I went to the dark side of administration. And, I say that jokingly, I love administration, but there was nothing more fun than teaching 7th grade English. Like to this day, when people are like, what's the best job you ever had? I'm like, I love being among like the quirkiness of like 12 and 13-year-olds. But I was a reading coordinator. I was an assistant superintendent of schools. At this point, I've been in education for almost 25 years, which seems like really old, but I feel like I'm just getting started because the kids are changing, the technology is changing, the evidence base is evolving. And so in some ways, it's like every year is brand new. But what I do now is I consult full-time. I teach some grad courses at the University of Pennsylvania, and I get to work with educators and leaders all over the world to really work with them to try to figure out how to do this so that we can increase outcomes for kids, but also find more balance and more joy in the profession itself, because goodness gracious, it is the best job, but it will break your heart. And we need to really try to figure out how we can make it more sustainable so that we can continue to have a world full of teachers.
I love that. Yeah. And for me, someone that works, maybe like yourself, Katie, that works with pre-service teachers, it is like seeing their roller coaster kind of and will continue, right, as they get into the profession. And for me, it's always been like, well, how do we navigate and how do we support them in navigating that crazy journey? And so I'm sure that we'll be able to speak to that. Katie, I know that you have a couple of books, maybe several. I've picked up a few, had a really good time reading them. And so I know that Sophie's bummed that she's missing out on this conversation, but maybe speaking to the Universal Design for Learning and kind of the work that you've done there.
So I just had my Sweet 16 book party. So I have written 16 books, which blows my mind.
Wow.
Because it feels like I just wrote the first one, but I love writing. I became an English teacher because I have like an incredible passion for writing. My colleague, I have a colleague, Chris Bronke, and he and I have been friends for years, and both of us were English teachers. And we were like, if reading and writing were like cousins, like writing's our favorite cousin, right? Because I absolutely love the opportunity to, share what I know and try to do that in a way that is like creative and that honors like the way that I would tell a story. But all of my books, most of which have been co-written with amazing, amazing educators. So I've co-written with the brilliant Kat Tucker. We've written 4 books together. She's the queen of blended learning. I've written books with Mirko Chardin. We've talked about like, how do you create more equitable design? I've worked with George Koros, who is just like this powerhouse in education. So again, I've written with so many amazing people. But ultimately, everything is grounded in this idea of universal design for learning. So what does that mean? Essentially, how do we design something that works for everyone when we're welcoming people to an inclusive space? And so I love analogies. I'm always coming up with new ones. And like the most basic analogy is that if you were going to invite a bunch of people over to your house for dinner, you would never just go like all in on creating a one-size-fits-all casserole and expect everybody to have the same experience enjoying it. And so let's imagine that you invite 32 of your besties over for dinner and you make a meat and cheese lasagna. And all you have is like this really dense, amazing, like it's like lifting weights, like a casserole and red wine. And you could make the most delicious lasagna in the whole world. You could like hand roll the noodles. You could like make the sauce out of tomatoes from your garden. We're not talking about quality here. We're talking about, is it appropriately designed for everyone? And of course we know it isn't, because we might have friends who are lactose intolerant, who are gluten sensitive, who have celiac, who have a plant-based diet, who are sober, right? It's not going to work for everyone. And it's not that there's anything wrong with the lasagna or the wine. It just can't be the only thing. And I think that for too long in education, we're designing these lessons and we're putting so much time and care and passion into these lessons. So I don't want to say that they're not strong, they're not brilliant, but they're simply just not working for all kids. And education is radical because we have to design things that are flexible enough for all kids. Now, we've figured it out in the dinner party world, because goodness knows no one would ever have a party like that if you had a group of inclusive guests. So at weddings, you usually either have a buffet or stations, or you get a card beforehand where you can pick, like, I want fish, I want vegetarian, I want steak. What are your dietary concerns? If you were going to have something at your house, like you might make a lasagna, go for it. But you might also have like a salad bar and encourage potluck. In addition to red wine, you're going to have some water, some coffee. And so what we're really talking about for universal design for learning is firm goals, flexible means. What is the goal? And what are the pathways that students can leverage to learn and share what they know? And everybody's always working towards the same goal. So if the goal is to have a lovely dinner, then we can be given lots of options and figure that out on our own. And it's not always on the teacher, because some people hear this and they're like, I'm not making dinner for 35 people. Like, I am not a short order cook. But it's about, what are the ingredients you have? What are the tools that are available? And then have people create their own plates. And that's what this is really all about, is how do we design something with firm goals and flexible means so that the user gets to really think about, okay, what is the goal? What's available? How do I create something based on what is available so that I have the best chance of meeting that goal?
I think the way that you put it with creating your own plates, like if I was coming into this with knowing zero about teaching, right, I would get that. I'd be like, oh, so the kids get to explore, the kids get to inquire, let's say, on what they need to meet that goal. I think it's so simply put, but so effective if you're explaining this to someone for the first time. So like going into the metaphor piece of it, what may this look like in a classroom?
Perfect. So let me talk about what it would have looked like 15 years ago, and let me talk about how much more efficient it is now, just because of the tools that we have available to us in terms of one-on-one devices and really innovative technology tools. So, 10, 15 years ago, it might have been, as an English teacher, a very traditional lesson would be you're working towards a reading comprehension standard. And so you give students a printed text. It could be a poem. It could be a primary source document. It could be a political cartoon. It could be like a scientific text, but we hand out a text on a worksheet. And then we ask students to independently read that text and then write an answer. What's really interesting is that is not a writing standard. It's a reading comprehension standard. So it's like, I want to know that you understood what you read, that you could answer questions about what you read while citing evidence from that text. Now, I'll talk about if it was a writing standard, but this one, let's just pretend it's not. We're really looking on like a reading comprehension standard. And so if we hand out the printed worksheet and we say, you're going to read it silently, you're going to pick up your pen, and then you're going to write an open response, and it needs to be done this period, we know we're excluding a lot of kids. So that is going to be too restrictive for kids who do not have the ability to decode at grade level, who have visual impairments, who are multilingual, who might be dealing with some fine motor challenges. And that could be just simply because of a disability or because of a sprained wrist after a basketball game, right? We know that some students are going to need a little bit more time to process, right? And so we look at that and we say, there's nothing wrong with that as an option. Right? If I'm saying we're all going to have a shared reading and then we're going to respond to what we've learned, some kids may choose to take a hard copy, to grab a highlighter, and to write the answer. That's okay, but it's not going to work for everyone. And so I think about what really is the goal. And so it might be that, like, how does this author use figurative language to create really strong imagery? Let's say that that happens to be the prompt. 10 years ago, I would have said to students, okay, so you can either have a printed copy, you can choose to access that digitally. And that might mean that I actually have to record my voice reading it out loud, or I might have to retype it to make sure that they can access it into their learning management system. Or I could give an option maybe for students to read in small groups. And so I start off by saying, all right, everyone, the goal of today is to ensure that you really understand how this author uses figurative language and how that creates really effective imagery. Before we begin, give me about 10 minutes to just like help to frame and chunk what we're doing, why we're doing it. I want you to know what your options are. And then I want to support you to quote unquote, make your own plate. So you're going to decide what is the best way for you to access that text? What is the best way for you to annotate that text? And how do you want to share with me what you have learned? Here's the rubric I'm using. And so students could say, well, I would like to print a hard copy. I would like to highlight it. And then I would like to share what I know in writing. But another student might say, I'd like to work in a small group. So another student can read it. And then I want to fill out a graphic organizer while I'm listening or while we're reading. And then I want to share with you what I know by recording a short video on my device where I'm going to answer all of the questions, but I'm going to do it in video, right? Firm goals, flexible means. But there was still like a lot of heavy lift from the teacher because the teacher is trying to make this text accessible. The teacher is trying to say, okay, let me share with you 3 different ways to annotate text. Let me create a choice board. You can choose something off the choice board. But now I can simply say to a group of students, okay, everybody, today we're going to be talking about figurative language and imagery. One option is to come over here with me in a small group. I'm going to review what you need to know about figurative language. The other option is to launch a community on School AI and have 5 minutes with a bot where it's going to quiz you and tutor you and ask you questions about figurative language. And you can type, you can have it read aloud, you can speak to it, but just dive in, launch an activity about figurative language, and you can do it that way. And then you are all going to have the text digital, and you can choose to translate it and read it first in L1 before you read it and answer the question in English. You might choose to have it read aloud. You might have Snoop Dogg read it out loud for all I care. You might print a copy and be able to annotate. And if you're looking for ways to annotate, you could then go on to a bot and say, what are 3 really good ways that might help me to annotate this text, given that these are my strengths, these are my preferences. And then say to students, here's the rubric. You decide how you want to share what you know on the rubric. I don't need to give you anything. You're creative. So you can talk with one another. You can think about how do you potluck this? How do you bring your own idea to say, oh, you know what? I actually learned a really new cool tool in digital literacy class, and I would love to try it out here to show you what I know about this text based on this rubric, right? And so we're creating these classrooms that can support multiple tasks and formats, and that frees me from being at the front of the room directing everything. So I can pull small groups, I can work with individuals, I can help them to realize when they need to take a no thank you bite. They've tried something, it's not like leveraging their strengths, it's not allowing them to move forward as a learner. We need to say, you know what, you tried it, It's not going to work right now. Let's try something else, right? So I'm much more of a facilitator. It's very student-centered. It's very student-driven. And I have to ensure that students are, in fact, making progress towards that goal. But I don't have to be the one to decide anymore how they do that.
I love that. Yeah. So I have had discussions with my student teachers and interns about this concept, right? And Katie, I'm sure like this is not, news to you, but like a lot of times like our new teachers are jumping in and having a mentor that is not teaching that way, right? And almost, I hate to say this because I don't like calling it classroom management. I like calling it classroom culture.
Yeah.
But they put the culture of it first, the culture of I just want a contained environment that is that one size fits all, right? So if you were to be training, teachers that are within the first 5 years of the profession, let's say, what would you say to them with concerns of the classroom being managed and having that culture still be appropriate and effective for learning if you have that environment where, because you kind of mentioned like, oh, I'm meeting with a small group while students are being more independent. How do you train students for that level of independence, I guess is what I'm asking.
Yeah. So the first thing I would say is the idea of like compliance, control, it simply is not preparing kids for the realities of the world of work. So the World Economic Forum published their report in January of 2025 about the future of work. There's a brilliant chapter in there about like just the skills that our learners are going to need. So what are the fastest growing skills? What do we predict are going to be the fastest growing skills in the next 5 years? What are the skills that are going to be phased out, right? And there's this brilliant chapter. I think every educator should either read it or have a bot summarize it or drag it into Notebook LM and have Notebook LM create a podcast. But ultimately, I really think every educator needs to be aware of the way that we're currently running many classrooms is absolutely the antithesis of the type of environment that they're going to need to be able to flourish in college and careers. So what I would say about how we get students to do that is essentially, as with anything, you have to think about the importance of scaffolding. So a lot of us probably remember this. I do it, then we do it together, and then you do it on your own, and then ultimately we want individuals to do it. And I think that the same thing is going to be true for almost any skill, that you do need some sort of opportunity to have like really brilliant, although very brief, explicit instruction and modeling from somebody who really does have expertise in that area, who also has a relational connection with the learner to say, all right, everybody, there's 3 different really evidence-based ways to take notes. And by the time we get to 3 weeks from now, I am going to expect all of you have figured out what is the note-taking strategy, given what you like to do, given what you need to do to learn at high levels, and logistically what is just possible and available to you. I want you all to have a really good strategy to make your thinking visible in a way that's organized enough that you can use it to support your working memory, right? That's why we take notes. There's no real state standard or learning objective that students will know how to take notes, but we know that it's a really important strategy for students as they continue out through their lives, right? So I might say something like, listen, I'm going to teach all of you what Cornell notes are, right? It's that, it's like you put the question on the left, you put the answer on the right, you fold them over, right? And so I might say, let me just give you a quick 5-minute, overview of what Cornell notes are. And then I might say, now I want you to predict, to discuss, like, why might this be helpful? Or what are the materials that you could use? And again, you can choose to think and brain dump on your own. You can choose to have a conversation. You can choose to use your device and do a little bit of research to try to build your background knowledge, whatever works for you. And then I might model, like today, while I'm doing some explicit instruction, I'm going to metacognitively share with you as a note taker what I would actually do. Maybe I do this on a document camera. Maybe I do it digitally. I can encourage students to do it in hard copy if they'd prefer, if they have their notebooks, or digitally. But ultimately, I want everyone to experience this. I would call it a no thank you bite, but I have to make sure it's accessible. I have to make sure that they have opportunities to reflect, to process. And I might even say, we're going to have a formative assessment this week, and I'm going to allow you to use whatever notes you created with your Cornell notes, because I really want you to reflect and determine, is this something that made me feel more prepared? is this something that I used at all during the assessment? Or did I find that maybe it like supported my memory, but it didn't? But like, I'm being really cognizant about what I'm doing, why I'm doing it. I'm not grading the notes because a grade should represent the mastery of standards, and there are no standards that say Cornell notes. So ultimately, I'm giving them a tool, I'm giving them a strategy, right? At the end of the week, it's like, how do we feel like it went? Would you ever do this independently, right? And the truth is like, maybe I spend a week on Cornell notes, maybe I spend a week on sketch notes, and I collaborate with my art colleagues to come in and model that. And then maybe I do like more of your OneNotes, your tech, your AI note taking, and that might be with like the digital media specialist, right? I love interdis, I love collaboration. And so we create these three things. By the time I get to like the fourth week of school, I'm like, okay, well, you know what your options are, loves. Make your thinking visible to me. I'm going to give you 5 minutes to think about like what works best for you today, right? The internet is down. Well, you can't do any apps that require online. You forgot your notebook. Looks like you can't do it in person today, but there's always a way to do this. And so now you know the strategies. But what's really interesting is I work with adults predominantly. I've never in my life seen an adult take Cornell notes exactly, ever, right? And I work with tens of thousands of people a year. Like when you walk around, you have people who are on those like nifty little boards that like look like an iPad, but it's actually like a notebook, right? And then you have your iPad note takers, you have your sketch note, and there's some things that are close. But like as a teacher, I would make kids like take out the notebook, fold the paper in half, skip 3 lines between the questions, right? And I'm like, why? Why did I do that? Because someone told me to do it, that I trusted, that mentored me, and that was honestly worked really well before classrooms were more inclusive, more diverse, and before we were competing with robots. So I love saying to kids, let's try these things out. How did it go? And then ultimately leading them to say, all right, so here's a couple of options, but I want you to feel safe enough to take a risk to try something new at any time, because like note-taking, visible thinking is evolving. And so I don't want to say this is the only way to do it. I'm going to show you a couple of really good evidence-based ways to do it. But ultimately, we don't know what's going to be the best note-taking strategy in 10 years. And maybe one of our kids comes up with it.
So this is a super interesting point to me, because as a former social studies teacher, I always struggled with how I flipped my classroom with respect to how I set up the notes for the kids. Mm-hmm. And I always struggled with like, well, do I just let them take notes however they want? Because a lot of times in credential programs or just like general training, and I'm talking like before the pandemic perhaps, but like this concept of sentence framed notes, right? Where they just fill in the key areas. I'm just curious what your thoughts are on that, because to me, that seems like we are locking them in a box where all they're really doing is filling in certain words. Like a fan, not a fan, just curious what your thoughts are.
I'm never not a fan of anything as an option, ever, right?
Okay.
Like I think that any option can be made available to any student. My hesitation, and where I start to ask a lot of questions, is the assumption that everybody would benefit from the same support. And I also think that we have to really try to interrogate our practices of why are we doing this? Like, because it's good for learning. We have so many kids in this country, in this world, who are not learning. We're not increasing their learning outcomes, right? And so it's like using these traditional practices like maybe evidence-based, but like an evidence base for especially an experimental study is such a controlled environment, right? You're able to control for confounding variables. You're able to ensure the integrity of the methodology. Whereas just because a practice is evidence-based, even in that tightly controlled setting, it didn't mean it worked for every kid. It meant that group A and group B kind of like went head to head, and group A, because of this treatment or this intervention, did better. But it doesn't mean that every kid benefited from that intervention. And so I think a lot of the times we see something as evidence-based and we're like, okay, great, now it's going to work for everybody. And that's just not accurate. The research wouldn't support that. And even if we are using an evidence-based practice, it doesn't mean that we're necessarily using it with the same integrity that was established with the methodology of the original study. So one of the things that I share a lot of is people will always say to me, something doesn't work. The curriculum doesn't work. This discussion method doesn't work, right? And so my first question is, well, is it an evidence-based strategy and how do you know? So, like just because you saw it online doesn't mean that it has like a really strong evidence base. And we've established that this given group A and group B was pretty good for kids. And so, sometimes it's like, well, I'm not sure. And we'll realize that it isn't. And it's like, okay, so like you tried something that was really innovative. And now you've established that maybe it's not the best option for students in your class. And that doesn't mean that it's the strategy, but maybe it wasn't built with enough intentionality. Maybe students didn't have enough time to build the routine, right? But we're not going to say it works or doesn't work without really asking a lot of questions. But if somebody says, well, it does have an evidence base, I'm like, okay, so did you go and actually look at the methodology for the study? Because we see things like self-reported grading is good for kids. That does not mean like pick your grade at the end of the year and now suddenly this kid grows 2 years. That is not how it works, right? There's a ton of intentionality of like going in and unpacking standards, of co-creating rubrics, of sitting side by side, conferencing with kids. What do you think you got? Why do you think you got that? The teacher feedback, right? And it's not just like, well, here's the strategy. And I think so many people are like, well, I tried the strategy and it didn't work, without saying, well, in that study, teachers had 2 weeks of training beforehand. They met with every kid individually with one-on-one conversations twice a week for an entire year. There were rubrics for every single assignment, right? That's the stuff that if we expected the same outcome, we have to replicate that methodology. And we often don't have enough time to really sit and think about what we're doing and why we're doing it to make really, really great decisions. Now, this is where I love the ability to do like a deep research on AI, is you can actually say, this is a strategy I'm interested in trying. Is there an evidence base? What is the methodology for that evidence base? What type of growth can I expect? How do I design for this? How do I integrate this in what I'm currently doing? And then we can actually look at that as action research in our own space.
Wow. Yeah. And I think like, because you kind of hit on a few things. One is implementation or perhaps lack thereof.
Mm-hmm.
And then also like with respect to UDL, a lot, I think, of what you speak on, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but like teaching teachers how to be flexible with respect to their practice, because you're right, like just because it worked in one context doesn't make it exactly right, like as a packaged item for your own students and for your own classroom, right? So I think like the importance of being able to give yourself the tools and the know-how to create and customize that flexible space for you. So important, so important. Something that you touched on a few times, I feel, was the assessment piece, right? And so I love this concept of like putting student ownership in that. But you also earlier touched on this concept of asking why. Like, why are we giving a formative assessment? Because oftentimes, and this resonates with me because I do the same thing, is sometimes I'm not doing an assessment for assessment's sake, but to actually use it to be more of a vehicle for learning, right? It's about the learning experience, not so much the assessment. What are some outcomes or perhaps some strategies around that, maybe that you haven't touched on yet?
I mean, I think the most important thing about any and all assessments is that they are construct relevant, which means like what actually is it that students have to know and do, and what are the ways that are available for them to do it. So there's two types of standards, whether you're working in higher education or whether you're working in preschool, but ultimately standards will outline what students have to know and what students have to be able to do. And those are two different things. And so what students have to know, those are content standards or knowledge standards. And they start with verbs that are synonymous with explain, albeit different depths of knowledge. So like you have your level 1 depth of knowledge, which is identify, define, recall. Then you go up a little higher and you have your summarize, your paraphrase, communicate. A little higher, evaluate, analyze, right? Explain. And then at the top, you have like your synthesis, your justification. But all of those are like, show me what you know, understanding the nuances and the depth of those different verbs. None of them say, explain the causes of, pick a category, right? Explain the causes of the Industrial Revolution on a multiple choice test, in a 5-paragraph essay, in a wax museum presentation, on a poster, in a Google slideshow. They don't say that, right? And that's what teachers kind of get to decide for kids. And if we realize that content standards lend themselves to a lot of flexibility, we have to think about, well, what is the non-negotiable success criteria? So if you're explaining the causes of the Industrial Revolution, you might say you need to touch on these 3 events. You need to cite textual evidence. You need to be able to use primary and secondary source documents. And now I can create a rubric or generate a rubric using these tools available that says, I want a standards-based rubric that truly unpacks the standard. So it's very clear what all students need to know and do, but that I'm not like basically putting them in a corner where they have to do it in writing, because it's not a writing standard. Now, that's your content. Your method standards are totally different, because there are standards for writing. There are standards for speaking. There are standards for, being able to solve 4-digit, like subtraction, addition, multiplication, whatever. And so we have to say, okay, well, if students have to write an informative text, they have to produce an informative written text. Like, that's non-negotiable. So I am actually going to assess the writing. And so maybe I don't provide any choice in the product, of which you do have to produce an informal, or rather an informative text, but I can be really flexible about the process. So maybe I can allow them to choose, what do you want to write about in terms of like the informative text? What is going to be your writing process? So for brainstorming, are you going to be talking? Are you going to be researching? Are you going to be dumping your ideas? For organizing, are you going to do concept maps, sketch notes, note cards, Post-its, and outline? Is it going to be digital? Is it going to be online? Drafting, is it by hand? Is it by typing fingers? Is it by using voice to text, assistive tech, augmentative communication? And I do want students to go through that drafting, that writing process. And then at that point, when we get to the revision point, you're doing peer reviews, you're doing writing conferences. That's a great time to maybe introduce artificial intelligence to ask for feedback. Do not change my words. This is what I drafted, but I'd love tips on how to make this stronger, right? When it comes to publishing, is it on a digital poster, right? Like a digital poster session where you're kind of breaking up the text with images and data. Is it a book? Is it an online book, right? So like, even within the focus of a firm goal, it's like, what am I doing and why am I doing it? But ultimately, every assessment should align very clearly to a single standard or multiple standards. And some people are like, well, why can't I just put them together? And it's because you will not know what the student actually can do already and what they can't do yet when you're tying all of those things together. So if I say, explain the causes of the Industrial Revolution in a 5-paragraph essay, and it needs to be handwritten, and the 5-paragraph essay is abysmal and has significant lagging skills, I'm like, does the kid not understand the content, or does the kid not know how to explain the content? Right. And so you want to be able actually to target standards, because that allows you to target instruction. And then once students have the skill set in both of those standards, then certainly you can begin to blend them. But we are responsible for teaching these lagging skills to students, and knowing that not all students need all of these skills, that makes that need for differentiated instruction and small group instruction to be even like, it's more important than it ever has been. But it means I cannot be up in front of the room, because I cannot do all of that at the same time.
Yeah, it's kind of what I'm hearing is like making thoughtful decisions between when to make visible to the students of the what and the how.
Yeah.
Right. Like sometimes, maybe we're only just looking at the what, because maybe we need to isolate the how, because I know the how is going to be a little struggle at first, right? Or flip that around, only work on the skill itself in isolation of the content.
Yeah.
I love that. To what degree do you think we should be using AI to be building these experiences, right? Like, I know some of these platforms do have like, oh, turn this into a UDL thing. I think that's cool. Obviously, I'm sure you think there should be a human eye alongside that.
Oh, always.
Always, right?
I mean, what I would say is that, I'm a big supporter of blended learning. And the blended learning definition I use is from my dear friend, Kat Tucker, which is simply a blend of teacher, direct, explicit instruction, online learning, which is using all of these innovative tools, your adaptive softwares, your AI, your basic Google suite, your Microsoft suite, and then offline learning, which is about relationships, which is about conversations, which is about collaboration, which is about community. And a blended learning environment should be able to have all three of those things. So in no scenario would I argue that all things should be online and digital, but I also wouldn't argue that we should not use technology. And I think sometimes there's a little bit of an overcorrection depending on like the school or the classrooms that you're observing, where you might have a classroom that's all tech all the time. And it's like, okay, so that's preparing students for, tech literacy, digital literacy, the use of AI. But like in some ways, we also need to build like some of the huge upcoming skills are teaching, mentoring, customer service, active listening, empathy, right? Students cannot practice those things if they're always plugged in individually to devices to personalize their experience. But if we're only ever like, let's sit and have conversations, let's learn from each other, let's do this cooperative work, right? Let's really lean in and listen to each other. Like, again, you have these skills that you need. And then the idea of having great instruction is this relational instruction of being able to sit with the kid and be like, hey, talk to me about what you're doing. What are you struggling with? Okay, let's work on this together, right? And so all three of those things are important for students, and all three of those things are important for adults. And so, yesterday I was working with a group of adults. We were talking about artificial intelligence and universal design. And I'm like, let's think back to when you used to get a professional learning community together in a room, and you would have to spend an hour with one standard unpacking the 4 PLC questions from the do fors, which are, what is it that all students have to know and do? How will we know if they can do it? What are we going to do if they have significant lagging skills and can't do it yet? And what do we do if they've already accelerated and have mastered it, right? Those are like the 4 PLC questions. And we would spend hours and hours and hours and hours on that, right? And I'm like, and wouldn't it be a better use of time to literally upload that PDF into a large language model to say, this is the standard that we're using. Can you fill this out for us? Done in a second. And then our expertise, our relationship, our knowledge of kids, we can sit there and have an actual conversation about, does this resonate? Do you all actually address this? If we're talking about characterization, we're talking about point of view, we're talking about character motivation, we're talking about character bias. Do all of you touch on that? Actually, no, I don't touch on that quite a bit. Okay, let me show you what I do in my class generally, right? It's that co-creation that is supplementing the AI. And to be totally honest, Kat Tucker and I just wrote a book called, it's basically about an AI enhanced design framework for UDL and blended learning. And we tried tools for months. We spent hundreds of hours trying different tools, and we were never able to find a lesson that was appropriately designed for a really inclusive class with one prompt ever, regardless of tools. It requires the brilliance of the instructor to say, okay, I love the flexibility here, but I'm really going to need a teacher's guide to go along with it because I have a lot of multilingual learners and I'm still struggling to how to integrate this. Or what you noted there is not construct relevant. This is a writing standard, and we can't just have students opt out of writing and telling us instead, so I need you to get rid of that. Or I have a co-teacher, and so now I'd like you to take this and reimagine it with a parallel lesson and alternative teaching based on the fact that I have these IEP goals in my class, right? And so it is something that can be much more efficient, but it's not something that will ever be able to replace the brilliance of someone who knows their content, who has a passion for teaching and learning, and who knows kids.
Yeah, no, but it can certainly give back time, right? And something that you just touched on was like this concept of like, well, within the PLC process, before AI, how much energy went into the logistics of a PLC versus the actual conversation, which is really the heart of what you're supposed to be doing. Yeah. Love that. Love that. So Katie, we are coming close up to time here. And I do want to take a moment to dive into the big question we ask everyone on the show. But that is, what is top of mind in education for you?
For me, I would say that it is like two sides of the same coin, because on one side, let's call it heads, I'm always thinking about just how we can do this more efficiently and more innovatively, given all of the tools that are popping up every day to support really adaptive, personalized, innovative learning. On the flip side of that, I'm acutely aware of the World Economic Forum's work and concern about the lack of skill set for building relationships, for mentoring other people, for active listening, and for customer service. And so I think that what's on my mind all the time is how do we blend together the need for these really high tech skills without ignoring the human skills that have been neglected in this tech boom. And certainly we know during COVID. And so for me, it's not about, oh gosh, let's look at this new tool. Let's see how we can use this tool, because they're going to be a dime a dozen and they're going to keep growing. But how does this tool allow us to make some of the processes that we use and that students use more efficient, so we can gain more time for the human relational element of learning, which is going to be critical for future success as well.
Yeah. And I would say that's such a hard balance to be had right now. Like almost any classroom that I walk into for an observation, it's like kind of like what you said earlier. It's like all tech or no tech.
Yeah.
And it's almost like we're picking teams. Can I say that? Like of just like where do you want to go with it? But I do love like your take and the take of Dr. Tucker, like of just this, like, you know, having those three elements, right, of being able to build a classroom in that way. And going back to public education fairly recently, the first thing I noticed was like, oh, you all don't know how to communicate with each other. Like you don't know how to talk, and like being able to build those skills, I think was like out of the gate the one thing I really got focused on, because it is something. And I love that you point out the customer service piece, because you see it in our classrooms, but you see it in our communities as well.
Oh, we do.
Yeah.
I went to a coffee shop in a hotel the other day, and the woman was so sweet. But I walked up and I was like, I would love a hot mocha latte. And she said, I don't even know what that is, in a coffee shop. And she was like, lovely. So I'm not going to point fingers, but I am going to say somebody was supposed to train this gal, right? And so it comes back to not only customer service, but teaching, mentoring, right? Is like, before you leave someone alone as a barista in a coffee shop, like you need to make sure that this person has the knowledge and skills to be able to work independently. And so, you know, for me, I looked at it as like, this is a real teaching opportunity, because she was put in a position that is not great for her to be successful. But it comes back to who is communicating with her. And so when I think about, you know, students who have these lagging skills, it's not like, oh, look at the students, look at the students. It's like our organizations are responsible for preparing students to be successful in the spaces that they are. And, you know, certainly there's lots of really complicated variables, but I think that most people would have been really frustrated with this gal. And I was more like, what does like the workforce development look like here, that this poor kid is by herself and she's like not familiar with what a mocha latte is, and she's expected to like deal with this line of people behind her. So I was like, no worries. Why don't you just make me a coffee, put in 2 cups of mocha, I'll deal with it myself. That's chocolate. And she was like lovely and sweet. But, you know, I feel like in some ways we are like passing kids through a system. We are working so hard. This is not for lack of trying. Teachers are exhausted. But then like ultimately the outcomes are that kids simply don't have the skills they need to be successful yet, but we can change that.
Yeah. And then in the process, they're getting a lot of shade.
Gosh,
and like, well, yeah. And then a lot, you know, the whole like kids these days kind of thing, which
people said that about us when we were teenagers.
Exactly. Yeah. No. I love that. So Katie, before we wrap things up here, for people that are listening, watching, maybe have questions, like what are the best ways to reach out to get support?
Yes.
of that
So
nature?
I have a huge team of consultants. I think we're about 15 strong, our team, and we have people who have expertise in many different areas. Higher education, gifted and talented education, support for students who have the most significant intellectual and cognitive support needs. So we're a really diverse group of people. So pretty much any question you have, whether it's early childhood, whether it's higher ed, there are people on our team. You can find out more about all of us at novakeducation.com. That's Novak. And if you click on Meet the Team under About Us, you'll see everybody. And again, we do work all over the world with coaching, technical assistance, professional development to try to help schools and districts and organizations really reimagine what teaching and learning could look like through this lens of firm goals and flexible means.
Yeah, putting that up. Hopefully I got that correct there.
Nailed it.
On the screen. Yeah, that was a combo. Talk about choice of me searching and you talking it out. But yes, no, Katie, really appreciate you. Hopefully we get to do something like this again. And I'm really excited to see where your journey continues to go. I do see your name out there quite often. I'm actually reading one of your books at the moment. And I learned a lot just by chatting. So appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Awesome. All right, friends. Until next time, keep your hats on, but your minds open. Take care. Bye-bye.